Hi everybody, and welcome back to A Foggy Day on Olympus. Once again, I am Coel Campo, and we are here, well, not really on Olympus, but metaphorically on Olympus, trying to attain the view of the Olympian gods, the Greek gods who would be dispensing their judgment upon mankind from far above. And of course, it's very, very foggy, as usual.
And I am still Mike Pierce as well, tragically enough. And today we have the episode in our series that we've called Eastern Catastrophes. And this is In the Jaws of the Soviets, Poland Torn Asunder. So we're going to be looking at events in 1939 and what that meant for Poland, and particularly for the eastern part of it, which is Western Ukraine. And it's this that forms the main thread of what we're going to be looking at this week.
Yeah, and it's probably a good idea to mention this episode is really a part B, second part to the episode that we released last week. And so, I mean, it's really best to watch all of the episodes in a series together.
Right.
However, today's episode and last week's in particular go together. So we're continuing the story here.
Okay. So we're looking, as I said this time, at what happens in Poland in 1939. And of course, the story is, this is one of the most well-known events in history that everybody learned in school at one level. And that is that World War II starts and Poland is attacked by the Nazis. And some remember that it's also attacked by the Soviet Union. But most of the details of that are forgotten. And so we're going to be following that thread through a little bit. Now, in Moscow, on the 23rd of August 1939, the unthinkable happened. The bitter enemies, Hitler and Stalin, made an agreement with one another that we call the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, so named after their respective foreign ministers. And it was a non-aggression pact, but the secret clauses would lead to the division of the territories that lay between their countries. Now, this wasn't known at the time that the pact was made, but the very fact that it was made caused a sensation around the world.
And this is really, the reason it's such a surprise is because Germany and the Soviets had been enemies previous to this, right?
Right. But there's been a tendency to play down this episode ever since. First by the Soviet Union, and since 2000 by the Putin regime. Okay, the line taken is, since World War II, is that, Stalin of course knew that Hitler was going to attack him, so he was just postponing the inevitable. The justification given at the time was that Poland couldn't possibly hold off the Nazi assault, and so the Soviets moved in to protect those they could. This is nonsense. This was an agreement between them. Now, the story of this is told very well in a fairly recent book, 2016, by Roger Moorhouse, The Devil's Alliance. So the pact makes Nazi Germany and the USSR de facto allies. And this is one thing that's quite often forgotten, even in Britain, for example, that for the first nearly 2 years of the war, the Soviet Union, with which British relations had always been absolutely awful, was looked upon effectively as a Nazi ally. As soon as it was made, not only did it send shockwaves around the world, it caused a lot of communists in Western countries to quit the party. Loads of them said, this is one turning around on a dime too many. How can I possibly be part of a party that's allied effectively with the Nazis? But the reason it really made such a sensation was because everybody realised that war, which it was generally sensed was coming anyway, the way that Hitler was acting, that it made imminent war completely certain. And that assessment was indeed correct. So these maps show the planned divisions of Central Europe according to the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
So the Soviets took over the Baltic republics And then the plan was to take Finland too, but that part failed.
Well, that's what one sees by comparing the two maps. Right, on the one on the left, it's coloured in orange, supposed to be taken by the USSR. In fact, only a sliver of territory was taken. Finland proved a far, far more robust enemy than the Soviets had ever planned for. In the Baltic republics, they were able, not in 1939, but the following year, just to walk in. Finland, they certainly were not, and they suffered huge casualties. That's a little bit up the road, though. We're going to focus more narrowly on what happens in 1939. So, in our picture here, we've got the view from a Nazi aircraft on the 1st of September 1939. 4:40 in the morning, German planes bombed the city of Viljoen, killing several hundred inhabitants. So this is the start of the invasion. Our next picture shows the Nazis entering in triumph into Danzig. Now, you might remember that a kind of anomalous position between the wars.
It had been German inhabited, but it was an independent city-state between the world wars?
Yes. That was not really the will of the people who lived there. They would always have wanted to remain part of Germany. But they were in fact separated according to the terms of the peace treaty in Versailles in 1919. Well, local Nazis had controlled the city government for some years and had been pressing hard for unification with Germany. So when the Nazis invade Poland, they also move their forces into Danzig, and you can see Hitler entering the city on the 19th and everybody turning out to cheer him. The next picture is a similar one. Danzig grüßt seinen Führer. Danzig greets its Führer, so Hitler. But inside Poland proper, obviously this is creating tremendous fear. We've got a brilliantly colorized picture here of Polish youngsters watching a German air raid on Warsaw on the 14th, and a very upsetting picture, I'm afraid, of a 12-year-old girl, Kazimiera Mika, who's just discovered her sister, 14, who'd been killed by German machine gun fire while she'd been picking potatoes outside Warsaw that month. This became a very famous photograph. Kazimiera lived a long life, and in her old age was giving lectures about this whole episode.
Now, a casualty like this probably would have been an accidental casualty. They're not necessarily targeting civilians.
Well, they're bombing civilian areas. Precision bombing is hardly possible before very recent times, and the idea is to simply terrorize the population until they submit. So, was she particularly targeted? You know, it's actually possible. My speculation, which is all it is that the air crew, because I think it was a machine gun from a fighter plane or something like that, simply targeted whoever was outside on open ground. And they were civilians, and so there was a 14-year-old girl. No, it was absolutely ruthless stuff. Yeah. Wow. There isn't really any excuse for it whatsoever. Now, so much could be said about this, but we are going to shoot ahead and look at the results in the east of the country, particularly the southeast, i.e. Western Ukraine. This whole topic obviously has been covered exhaustively. It is not impossible. We might return to it at some point, but there's so much competition out there on the internet that we're not making a promise about it. Okay, so if we look at this map, this shows the kind of demarcation line where the various forces got. The Nazis began their offensive on the 1st of September. The Soviets didn't attack until the 17th, perhaps to give themselves a little moral high ground and to be able to argue that they were simply responding to German actions.
So the invasion in the east of Poland isn't simultaneous with the Nazi invasion from the west?
No, it's not. So yeah, there is that 16-day gap in between. But the Poles would certainly have lost to the Nazis alone. When the Soviets came in, that just compounded the problem and just speeded up the collapse, really. So we've got a pretty good picture here of this young couple in the east. They're in the city of Lvov, or Lviv as we now say. I'm wondering what to do next. She's a streetcar conductor, he's a soldier. So in all likelihood he would have been taken prisoner by the Soviets. She probably wouldn't. She's probably too working class for them to be interested in. It's possible, I suppose, that they might have got away to the southeast as some people did, and we'll look at that in a moment. Here's the Red Army, the Soviets, entering Lvov on September 22nd. Now, most of the city's inhabitants were Poles, but Ukrainians were hardly any more keen on becoming Soviet. Remember, the city had been occupied by Russian Tsarist troops in late 1914 to early 1915. So for middle-aged and older people in the city, they will have remembered Russians being there before, but that was under Tsarist auspices. This time it's under the communists. Well, our next picture shows some Polish soldiers escaping by crossing over into Romania, which is how some senior figures in the Polish government got out, and so too did a lot of the country's gold reserves. So they got out, and actually they went to London into exile.
Is this would that be part of why Poland has been so fought over, over the years? Because was there actually gold in Poland?
Oh well, no, it's just like it's not anything unusual.
Oh, I see.
In the sense that every country has gold reserves from their banking system to underpin their currency. So that's actually extremely valuable, and they needed to get that out, and they succeeded in doing so. I know this not actually from a history book, but from reading a novel that describes what happened. But the author concerned is absolutely obsessive about historical accuracy, and he wouldn't have dared to lie about something as important as that. He would not have made that up. Yeah, you're allowed to be amazed because, as you know, I read very, very, very few novels, and most of the ones I do read tend to be historical novels.
Right. Exactly.
Yes.
I always say to people that it's your fault that I read as much nonfiction as I do. So.
And some people accuse you of as though that was somehow something bad.
Exactly.
I'm astonished that for most people now don't read, but most of those who do, nearly all of what they read is simply novels. And I'm wondering how one's actually informationally much better off after reading that. I really don't know. Okay, so others, as we can see in this next picture, crossed over into Hungary, which would later on become a very reluctant ally of the Nazis, but at this point was trying not to be, although it was also trying to be sweet towards Hitler as well, because it wanted to get loads of its territories back that it had lost at the end of World War I. That's a very complex story in itself, and at some point we will certainly do at least a mini-series on modern Hungarian history, which is a tangled mess indeed. Well, next we have pictures of German and Soviet officers meeting up with one another in central Poland along the agreed demarcation line. Next one shows Soviet and German soldiers talking in the newly captured Polish city of Brest.
This must have been a very bizarre experience, even for the soldiers themselves. Until a few weeks before, they'd been expecting to fight one another at some point.
Yes, exactly. They had. So they must have been fairly stunned as well, and all the more curious, perhaps, about one another because of it. Although, of course, less than 2 years later, they really would be fighting one another. I would bet almost anything that that conversation there is going on in German. There will have been an awful lot more Soviets who will have spoken German than there will have been Germans who spoke Russian, although there'll have been some. And the next one shows, again, German Soviet soldiers fraternizing, also in Brześć-Litewski, Brest-Litovsk, same town. And yeah, and we got another one, German major and Soviet lieutenant at Augustov, again on the demarcation line. All right, well, let's have a look now at some Soviet propaganda. So this is one of many posters ridiculing the Polish eagle, which is a frequently occurring theme in Soviet propaganda.
And who are our unshackled peasants in the poster supposed to be?
Well, almost certainly Ukrainians, Belarusians, Eastern Slavs freed from the Polish landlord. I think that will have been the idea.
So we're right back to the propaganda line of the Polish-Soviet War of 20 years before this.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Exactly the same. And who knows, it may even have been what the Soviet propagandists actually thought. And even if they didn't, it was clearly they felt that was going to be the most fruitful line to take. Okay, so our next propaganda picture shows, it's a poster with grateful Ukrainian or Belarusian peasants looking up in the sky at the aeroplanes that had dropped these Soviet leaflets. The poster reads, "They got the long-awaited truth," which is a play on the word Pravda, which is the name of the Communist Party daily newspaper. Pravda meant truth. There's a little, I'm going to have to sneak in a Soviet-era joke here. The other part, newspaper was called Viesti, which means news, and the joke that many people dared to make if they were prepared to risk prison terms for it was that there was no news in, so no Viesti in Pravda, and no Pravda, no truth in Viesti. So yeah, so yeah, she's supposed to be delighted that she's going to be rescued by the communists. Well, our next picture shows local communists outside a public building. One of the first things that the Soviets did was to set up plebiscites in which everybody got to vote to ask to be allowed to be admitted to the Soviet Union. The same kind of thing we're seeing today, of course, in various bits of Ukraine that the Russians have captured, and the vote is inevitably, 99% in favour. So it's about legitimising their rule. So these local communists are obviously pleased, as were Jews who had been afraid that the Germans would capture the city. So these people are delegates to the Western Ukrainian National Assembly in front of Lvov's city theatre.
The Jews are looking at this thinking, oh, occupation under Russians or the Soviets isn't great, but the Germans would have been a lot worse.
Right, yes. Not all Jews had actually internalised how awful this was going to be, actually. A lot of them had simply fallen back on the traditional view of the Germans, the kind of view they'd taken, say, in World War I, where Germans coming was probably a good thing because they were less anti-Semitic than Poles or Russians or Ukrainians, right?
Right.
And hadn't mentally caught up with what had actually happened, the transformation that had happened in Germany, and how completely frightful the Nazis were. And some of them told themselves, oh, this is just politicians sounding off, it won't really be like this. Because their long-term historical experience had been that all cultural innovations and benefits and material good things had come from the West, from Germany. So maybe this would be okay. There are actually a few instances, not that many, but of some Jews trying to cross over from the Soviet-occupied areas into the Nazi-occupied areas, and officials at the border saying, this is really not a good idea. So it hadn't always sunk in, but most people had got hold mentally, as it were, of the new reality.
Yeah.
Well, we've got here a series of three little Soviet leaflets, I suppose, posters, the past, the present, and the future. So the first one, tak bilo, that's how it was. So we've got a Polish officer and a fat Polish capitalist riding a Belarusian peasant. And the second one, we have our brave Red Army soldier coming and knocking them off and freeing our peasant. So, tak je, that's how it is. So sweeping the oppressors aside. And the last one in the series is tak bude, that's how it will be. So the former victim gets to drive a tractor because socialism equals modernisation in the sunshine. It's almost certainly harvest time as well, every day of the year. So, yeah, this is how they wanted to be seen. Well, we've now got a really, really good account, given, and I'm borrowing here from this excellent book by Gross, Revolution from Abroad, the Soviet Conquest of Poland's Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia, and giving us eyewitness accounts and his own commentary on this occupation. So, first off then, from some eyewitness accounts. After the Red Army entered the village, this is Masov in Luboml county of the Volhynia voivodeship, Soviet officers ordered everybody to assemble and delivered a fiery speech saying that they brought freedom and equalisation to all classes. They said that they authorised people to go and take away what rightfully belongs to them and to avenge the pains of 20 years of exploitation. Kill and take the property of those who filled their pockets and barns with your blood. If you do not succeed on your own, the Red Army will assist you. So what's going on here is encouraging people to pay out local grudges, and if there's any problem about this, then the Red Army will intervene on behalf of whoever is poorer, or has been poorer. Someone else reports they ordered us to line up. They checked everybody's hands, and they ordered to step forward those whose hands were not worn out from physical labour, and beat them with rifle butts, and one policeman was shot with a revolver.
And they're saying, you know, people whose hands are not worn out from physical labor. This is because such people are assumed to be bourgeoisie.
Yes, that's the ideological reason. But it's also designed to eliminate all the existing leaders of society, political, commercial, intellectual, religious, and then it's easy to control what's left. I mean, this is why, you know, in much more recent times, Pol Pot's regime in Cambodia in the 1970s killed everyone who wore glasses. You get rid of those, you can control who are left.
Interesting.
So, yeah, that's what's going on. So the soldiers ran in town from shop to shop, bought up whatever they could, mostly watches, rolls, sausages, dress fabrics and bicycles. 2 Soviets went into a shop and took 20 watches, paid, and went to the next shop where they took dress material in whole rolls. They could barely carry it, but they saw sausage. Caller, let's go and buy the sausage now. And surely there is no sausage. There's only a wooden one on display in the window, like at home in Moscow. Because back in the Soviet Union, everything was in short supply. Right? What happens under any kind of capitalist system is that goods are rationed by price. That is to say, you and I buy what we can afford, and what we can't afford, we don't get to buy. Right? Whereas in a command economy, prices and production are set by government, and always prices are, well, they're completely unreal actually. When the Soviet Union finally came to an end, no factory owners knew what they should be paying for their raw materials, or what they should be charging for their goods, or how much they should be paying for their labour, because there was they simply had no experience, and you know, you could have been an economic genius and you couldn't have done any better. So the whole economy is kind of like a false situation. But one of the things that it means is that there is shortage of all kinds of basic goods. People may have money, but there's nothing to buy with it. So that's their experience. Oh well, they can't really be sausage, surely. They're just putting a wooden one in the window as a piece of symbolism. Okay, so this is the front page of the first local Ukrainian language edition of Crocodile, which was the main Soviet satirical magazine. That always makes me laugh in itself, because I mean, the communists are not really very good at jokes, you know, any more than fascists are. I mean, they try to make them, but they're always so heavy-handed, like, you know, cracking everything with a sledgehammer. This is depicting a worker, a peasant, and a member of the local intelligentsia handing in their ballots. And what are the ballots for? Well, voting to join the glorious Soviet Union. And of course it would have been suicidal to vote no. Well,
Right.
we've got a very interesting account from a local forester about being co-opted to help repress his fellow villagers. He relates, after I accepted election as head of the village committee, having been threatened with arrest if I refused, they told those assembled to disperse and took me alone for a confidential conversation, where they told me that they'd pay me well and that I'd be fine so long as I'd no longer think about Poland, because there would be no more Poland, and they would deport and arrest all Polish nationalists, not even a trace of them would remain, and the same would happen to me if I wouldn't do what they told me to do. I was given the following orders: to parcel the priest's land, to report to them everybody who's against the USSR, to indicate immediately who engaged in politics during Polish times, regardless of what political party, to tell people that they would not have to pay any taxes, to forbid the priest from going to the village school, to remove all official portraits and Polish national emblems, to keep the priest under observation, to confiscate all weapons, and to inform about everybody who goes to meet whom. Now, why would they take a mere forester to do this? Because they didn't trust people who were educated or had any kind of position in interwar Poland. Right? They were assumed to be bourgeois, and loads of those people were in fact arrested or even killed.
And we can assume this is a pretty standard description of what it was like, you know, to live under the communists.
Well, yeah, for someone in his position, I mean, I can't believe that we've got very many accounts by people like this. Maybe there are some others, but it certainly seems to be typical from all the information that we have. Yes. Well, here we've got a picture of residents from a small town in eastern Poland attending a meeting to greet the Red Army, and their banner reads, "Long live the great theory of Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin."
Yeah, this is exactly the sort of slogan that small town folk would spontaneously create for themselves.
Exactly, yes, yes. I mean, I've seen similar kinds of ridiculous stuff from supposedly spontaneous demonstrations organised by the government in the Soviet Union itself, and it's always equally absurd, you know, cumbersome, jargon-ridden stuff which no ordinary people would ever produce for themselves. Yeah. Well, now we're going to go into a passage from Gross himself, in which he tells us at some length about the experience of being occupied by the Soviets, and how this simply showed how incredibly poor was the place they had come from. The comparative well-being, he says, of the eastern Polish countryside, an ironic impression, I may add, for this was generally the poorest area in a relatively backward European country, made the soldiers wonder where the people were.
And they're wondering where the people were because they assumed that everyone they could actually see must be the local bourgeoisie.
Yes, that's what they're thinking. Ordinary people can't possibly be this well off. Right? Yeah. Indeed, local people report numerous conversations with sympathetic Red Army soldiers and officers who did know what was going on, who warned them about the future and in general commiserated that they were all now in the same boat. Soviet soldiers were ill-fed, ill-clad, smelly and unacquainted with a variety of material objects that were commonplace to Western Ukrainian and Western Belarusian peasants. Some Soviet cavalry rode with saddles and some without. Some soldiers had shoes, others only cloth wrapped around their feet. Some wore long coats, others short ones. Some had belts, while others had only strings attached to their rifles. Torn uniforms, dirty coats, hands and faces. They washed their boots in puddles. They picked papers off the streets and rolled cigarettes. They were pitiful, recalled a 10-year-old boy from Lvov. The visual contrast between the Wehrmacht, the Nazi army, and the Red Army underscored this overall impression for those who saw both armies in these days, as many people did, of course, because the country had been invaded from both sides. So if you're anywhere near the demarcation line, you might well have come across both types of soldier. Years later, in a labour camp, Karol Bartosz met a group of Soviet youths who'd been in Grodno in September 1939. Now, Grodno it would be in what was then northeast Poland and is now just inside Belarus. They'd been in Grodno in September 1939 as Red Army conscripts. They'd been confined to the Grodno barracks, but they frequently slipped into town and bought whatever they could, watches in particular. They went home for furlough, and only there, when showing off their acquisitions, were arrested by the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, and sentenced to 20 years in labour camps for, quote, counter-revolution and praise of capitalism. Well, the counter-revolution and praise of capitalism was kind of implied simply because they were showing off, look what wonderful things we've got from this place we've invaded.
Right.
What Red Army conscripts saw in this backwater of provincial Poland, in small villages and towns, not to speak of cities like Lvov and Vilna, were unknown marvels and undreamed of abundance. Now, it gets better. The sheer variety of material objects overwhelmed the newcomers. After the families of those assigned to administer the newly conquered provinces had arrived, it became proverbial as a joke how Soviet women wore nightgowns and slips to the opera and various gala performances as if they were the most elegant dresses. A soldier was seen outside a hosiery shop wearing women's bras over his ears for earmuffs. Another, standing in the middle of the street, tried to blow one up, looking it over with incredulity. They bought up everything, while at the same time denying that they lacked anything in their own country. They'd been primed to do this, right? Do you have oranges? We produce them in factories, the Soviet soldier would answer. Do you have Amsterdam or Greta Garbo? We have plenty, u nas всё есть, was the standard reply. And young pranksters in Lvov and other towns entertained audiences by engaging Soviet soldiers in such conversations. Yet even a young, ardently committed Jewish communist recalls a moment of pause after the initially breathtaking enthusiasm that overtook her and her friends. She says, "First contact with the Russians, I mean the Soviet soldiers, struck us with something strange and unpleasant. We thought that every soldier was a communist, and therefore it was also obvious to us that each must be happy. So their comportment, their behaviour struck us as queer. First of all, they're looking after things, after material objects, watches, clothing, with so much interest and so much rapacity. We waited for them to ask how was life under capitalism and to tell us what it was like in Russia. But all they wanted was to buy a watch. I noticed that they were preoccupied with worldly goods and we were waiting for ideals."
It sounds like their government had tried to instill materialism in the philosophical sense, but that all they'd really instilled was materialism in the sense of a desire for more things.
That's exactly right. And I think that was really a constant across communist regimes over time, actually.
And you have an anecdotal story to go along with this from when you were living in Germany.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I'm afraid I wasn't alive in 1939, although, of course, you like to think that I was. But yes, back when I was
Surprised.
right, yeah, yeah, back when I was a lefty idealistic youth, I went and worked in a factory in West Germany for a year, and about a week after I'd started, I was joined on the shop floor by two young brothers, guys about my age or just a little older actually, who had just escaped from communist Czechoslovakia. What they'd done was to go on holiday, on vacation to Yugoslavia, which was not part of the Warsaw Pact, but was nevertheless a fellow communist country, and they'd sneaked onto a yacht and sailed over the Adriatic to Italy and made their way up to Germany, where they had various friends and contacts, other people who had escaped from their area, and they got a job there. And I made friends with them, but I was constantly appalled by them because they were so crude and materialistic in exactly the same sense. They utterly despised idealism, never mind just mine, idealism of any sort whatsoever. And I later actually managed to go and visit their parents in communist Czechoslovakia because they couldn't go back. They'd been sentenced to 2 years imprisonment in absentia for having, quote, violated the border, which was communist duck speak for escaped, darn it. But yeah, it was a sobering experience for me, being confronted with the reality of a communism which, although actually horrible and severe, was nothing like as severe as the variety that we're talking about here in the middle of Stalin rule in the Soviet Union. Yeah.
This is sort of like the same idea that Americans, when they're young, are tend to be more leftist or socialistic and idealistic, and then they become older and they have to start paying taxes, and then they sort of start to fall more on the conservative side of things.
Well, that's the usual kind of trajectory. Yes, yes. I mean, I realised at that point that just how bad communism was. It took another decade or so for a lot of the rest of the nonsense to be knocked out of my skull by other experiences, which we will not delay ourselves with here. Yes. Yes, exactly. Oh dear. That's what my parents were thinking at the time, I can tell you. All right, well, just to finish off with a few pictures and mopping up a number of important details here. So just glancing back westwards, in the German-occupied zones, Jews were already being marked out, having to wear a yellow Star of David on their coats and so on. These are in Gostynin in Poland in October. But we should pay attention as well to this city of Vilnius, which was captured by the Red Army in mid to late September, and they gave it to Lithuania. Now, viewers will remember from our last episode that it had been fought over between Poland and Lithuania 20 years before, just a bit less, in 1920 actually, and Poland had won. So the Soviets played the role of being beneficent, giving this city, which was, almost 90% Polish population, giving it to Lithuania, knowing full well that their intention was just a few months later to soak up all of the Baltic states themselves, Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia. So there's more than a little irony there. But for a few months at least, the Lithuanians could tell themselves that they had, after all, captured this city that meant so much to them, or it's been given to them. So our next picture shows a Lithuanian soldier looking down at the city that November. Only 6% of its population by that time spoke Lithuanian. It had been, I think, a little more than that, but it had been part of Poland for a while. So the next picture here shows the Soviet annexations in 1939 and 1940. So eastern Poland, the Baltics, and much further south Bessarabia, which is what we would now call Moldova, which had been part of the Russian Empire, given to Romania at the end of World War I, and now the Soviets were taking it back again. Okay, now to finish with a rather grim episode here. Polish elites, officials, other people who were simply inconvenient for whatever reason, intellectuals, priests, loads of them were sent to Siberia. So men, women and children, whole families, during late 1939 and 1940. And of course, many of them died en route or when they arrived. The conditions were extremely harsh. But of the Polish soldiers who were captured, the officers were almost all killed in March and April 1940 in the massacres of Katyn. Actually, you can see from this map here that not all the massacres happened actually at Katyn, but we tend to name them all after this one town. It was done secretly, and the whole the discovery of the graves happened later in 1943, and there's an endless catalogue of lies told by the Soviets about this. We will revisit this subject in later episodes. But for those who want to pursue it, you could hardly do better than Jane Rogoyska's recent book, Surviving Katyn. It's seen at least partly through the lens of one of the very, very few officers who wasn't killed, but who, precisely for that reason, had a good view of what happened to the officers after they were captured, during the period of their imprisonment, right up to, or at least very, very close to the point where they were, in fact, massacred. Because for Stalin to kill the Polish elites was to decapitate Polish society, make it easier to Sovietize the population. There's also a really good film made in 2007 about this. During the years of communist rule of Poland after the war, of course, this was forbidden to be told, even though nearly everybody knew really what had happened, but you had to pretend that you didn't know. So this movie gives a portrayal of that. And finally, we're back with our map again. So the peoples of the Baltic states and Bessarabia, Moldova, they're subjected to very similar treatment. Elites either killed or taken deep into the Soviet Union, and loads of them dying there. And because of this horrible treatment, what this meant was that loads of these populations were prepared to welcome the Nazi invasion when it happened just under 2 years later in June 1941. And that's very ominous indeed. There were large numbers of people in Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Belarus, Ukraine, and so on, who actually welcomed the Nazi invasion when it came at the height of World War II. But that's something that we'll be looking at next week.
Something that has been sort of, I guess, rumbling around in my brain for a while as we've been talking about this is, why is it that Poland and Ukraine in particular, that there was so much action in those places? Like, is it just because of geographically they're situated between Germany and the Soviets, and they're on this path for world domination, or what is it that makes them so special? Apparently it's not gold reserves, so.
No.
Or gold mining.
Well, it is an extremely special area. Partly it's geography, as you say. They're between two Goliaths who are prone to come into frequent conflict. So they're likely to be the battlegrounds, as they were in the First World War and in the Second World War. I mean, the Soviet deaths in World War II were absolutely astronomical, but an incredibly high proportion of those were actually people in Ukraine, because that's where the battles were fought. Right. So yeah, it's that, but it's because of the fact that Ukraine is a breadbasket, right? And that's true in the long run of history. I mean, as Tim Snyder likes to point out, we all like to think that Western civilization, starts with ancient Greece and Athens and all of that. If it hadn't been for the Pontic steppe, there wouldn't have been any great Greek civilization, because you can't grow a lot of wheat in Greece. It's kind of rocky, it's islands, can you survive on fish and olive oil? Probably not. Right, so you go right that way back. It's a crucial part of the world even then, with the Scythians, and it was crucial, as we saw in the last episode. Was it the last episode? I think it was in World War One. The Germans really, really wanted it because they were desperate for food, and the same kind of calculations are going on there. Actually, there was another form of gold that the Nazis were after in World War Two, but we're getting ahead of ourselves here, and that was oil. Well, Ukraine doesn't have a whole lot of oil, but Azerbaijan does, and it's also another route down into the Middle East. Right? One of the things that finally did for the Nazis was that they simply ran out of gas to supply their war machines. They were trying to make artificial petrol and stuff like this, and milking what there was in the Romanian oil fields of Ploiești for all it was worth, but it was nothing like enough. They got two shots. One was Rommel had to defeat the British in North Africa and punch right through to Iraq and places like that to get oil, and that didn't work. And the second shot was to break through in Stalingrad, get down to the Caucasus, get to Azerbaijan, and ideally down to the Middle East from there, and that didn't work. So they were done, really. But we're getting way, way ahead of ourselves here.
Yeah.
Yes. So Ukraine really mattered. It mattered for food, and it mattered as the road towards oil. Yeah.
But nowadays, those aren't really excuses that Putin could use anymore for invading Ukraine.
No. Although the war itself is having terrible effects on the world food supply. I mean, Americans in particular are complaining about grocery goods price inflation and this kind of stuff. Well, there isn't really a lot that can be done about that until the war stops. It's having terrible effects, but I mean that is as nothing compared to people, particularly in countries like Egypt and many others, who are absolutely dependent on Ukrainian and somewhat Russian grain, and loads of those people are going to starve. It's not, never mind grocery prices going up. It's going to be like serious hunger. So that's not really why Putin's invading. That's to do with some other things that we hadn't originally intended to look at in this series, but I think we will get around to it at the end. Yeah.
I think at the beginning we set out for this series to be, I don't know, what did you say, maybe 2 or 3 episodes, and we've really gone way past that at this point. So
yeah. We did look in that first episode at the element in the Russian-Ukrainian conflict over history and meaning and identity, and both national myths claiming the same events as absolutely central parts of their own meaning and identity as nations, and that's highly problematic. Yeah. So.
Right. It makes for a very complicated story in lots of
right, and it's about to get a whole load murkier as we go much further into World War II, which we will do next week. So do stay with us, people. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. And if you enjoyed this, please repost it to social media. And if you didn't like it, please repost it to social media and tell all your friends how much you hated it and why they should look at it to see to come to just the same view. All publicity is good publicity.
Right, that's right. Yeah, we're not beyond any of it.
No. Especially, hang on, I'm just tucking my horns back in.
All right, everyone. Thanks for staying with us. We'll see you next week.
Thank you. See you next week. Goodbye now.